As the Western lands adjusted to life without emperors, the East looked on with restless eyes. Constantinople, strong and radiant, was not content to let the world shrink. In its palaces, emperors dreamed of banners flying once more over Rome, Carthage, and Spain. The empire had fallen in the West, yes, but in the East it lived on, and it yearned to reclaim what was lost. In the 6th century, Justinian rose to the throne. Small in stature, sharp in thought, tireless in ambition, he was no ordinary emperor. He saw himself as heir to Augustus and Constantine, not just in title but in destiny. The empire, he believed, was not half a thing, it was whole, and it must be whole again. Beside him stood Theodora, empress, once an actress, now a figure of remarkable will. History remembers her as strong, clever, and unyielding. Where Justinian hesitated, she urged courage. When he nearly fled in the face of rebellion, she is said to have declared, "Purple makes a fine shroud. Better to die an emperor than to live without a crown." Her words steeled him. Together they ruled not just as sovereigns but as partners. In Constantinople, Justinian set his vision in motion. He summoned lawyers to gather the scattered statutes of centuries. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It would shape Europe for 1,000 years, echoing in courts far beyond his reign. He summoned builders, and they raised Hagia Sophia, a church of domes and light. Its vast canopy seemed to float on air. Its walls glittered with golden mosaics. When Justinian first entered its completed halls, he is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have outdone you." Yet even as laws were codified and churches rose, Justinian's gaze turned westward. He dreamed of reconquest, and to achieve it he needed soldiers, ships, and a general of genius. That general was Belisarius. Young, disciplined, and loyal, Belisarius had the courage to attempt the impossible. He trained his men with precision, drilled them with iron discipline, and inspired them with vision. With fewer troops than his enemies, he relied on cunning, speed, and faith in strategy. First came Africa. The Vandals, masters of Carthage, had grown complacent. Their fleets once terrorized the Mediterranean, but now their kings quarreled. Belisarius struck swiftly. In the year 533, his ships set sail. Crossing stormy seas, they landed on African shores, and in a matter of weeks the Vandal kingdom collapsed. Carthage, the jewel of Africa, was Roman once more. Imagine the sight: citizens of Carthage lining the streets, watching the eastern banners rise. Some wept, remembering old Rome. Others watched in silence, unsure whether this new Rome would endure. But in that moment, Justinian's dream seemed real. The West was not beyond reach. From Africa, Belisarius turned to Italy. The Ostrogoths, heirs of Theodoric, still ruled, but their unity was fragile. Wars of succession had weakened them. Belisarius marched north, capturing Sicily, then Naples, then Rome itself. For the first time in generations, the city of the Caesars was under imperial banners again. Bells rang, churches filled, and people rejoiced. The dream of Rome restored had come alive. Yet the Gothic war dragged on. The Ostrogoths fought fiercely, retaking Rome at times, besieging cities, refusing to yield. For years the peninsula became a battlefield. Farms burned, villages emptied, monuments crumbled. The reconquest was real, but it was costly. By the time the dust settled, Italy was scarred, its people weary, its cities diminished. Rome itself, once queen of the world, was a shadow, still holy, still revered, but no longer the heart of empire. Belisarius, loyal servant, returned to Constantinople hailed as a hero, yet even he felt the weight of exhaustion. Wars drained coffers, plagues swept cities, and dreams of empire always demanded more. Still, Justinian pressed on. In Spain, his armies seized a strip of land, a Roman foothold in Hispania once more. From Africa to Italy to Spain, the map of the Mediterranean seemed to glow with restored order. Yet holding these lands proved harder than taking them. Distance stretched supply lines, local peoples resented taxes and conscriptions. Enemies lurked at every border. And then came plague. Around the year 541, pestilence struck, what would be remembered as the plague of Justinian. Ships carried rats, rats carried fleas, fleas carried death. In Constantinople, corpses filled the streets, fires burned day and night to cleanse the air. Priests prayed, doctors despaired, some said half the city perished. Across the empire, villages emptied, fields lay fallow, armies thinned. For those who lived through it, the world seemed cursed. One year had brought reconquest and glory, the next brought silence and graves. Justinian himself fell ill but survived. His empire endured, but weaker, stretched, scarred. Still, the Eastern Empire remained the greatest power of its age. Constantinople's walls stood tall, its fleets sailed, its laws endured. While the West drifted in fragments, the East held steady, preserving the Roman name for centuries more. Yet the West was not abandoned entirely. Seeds had been planted. The Franks grew stronger, tied to Catholic faith. The Visigoths would eventually embrace the same faith, uniting rulers and people. The Church bound regions together, creating a network of belief that no army could conquer. Rome had fallen, yes, but Christendom was rising, and with it, the Middle Ages began to take clearer shape. While Justinian's banners waved across Africa, Italy, and Spain, the question lingered. Could these victories last? For conquest is one thing, but holding land is another, and as the years passed, the costs grew clear. In Italy, the Gothic War had left scars deeper than any victory could heal. Rome itself, still holy, still revered, suffered siege after siege. Aqueducts were broken, fields abandoned, and statues toppled. Once, Rome had been a city of over 1 million souls. By Justinian's time, and even more so after the wars, it dwindled to tens of thousands. The Colosseum stood silent, its arches home to weeds and birds. Travelers walked past ruins with awe and sorrow, speaking of greatness now gone. Yet amid the ruins, faith blossomed. Churches rose where temples had crumbled. Shrines to martyrs dotted the land. Pilgrims still came, kneeling at the tombs of apostles Peter and Paul. Rome, the imperial capital, was no more, but Rome, the spiritual heart of Christendom, grew stronger. The papacy, though not yet supreme, was finding its voice. In years to come, the voice would guide kings and challenge emperors. Meanwhile, Ravenna glittered. Under Byzantine governors, mosaics adorned churches like San Vitale, their golden light depicting Christ, angels, and even Justinian and Theodora themselves. Soldiers marched in disciplined ranks, officials collected taxes, priests chanted liturgies. For a time, Italy felt Roman again, though it was Rome of the East, not the West. In Africa, the reconquest at first seemed secure. Carthage bustled with trade, its harbors filled with sails. Grain once more flowed toward Constantinople, but old tensions stirred. Berber tribes raided from the hinterlands. Revolts shook cities. Governors struggled to balance imperial demands with local realities. Africa would remain Byzantine for a century, but it was never truly at peace. Spain, too, proved difficult. The strip of territory held by the Byzantines clung to the coast, a foothold more symbolic than decisive. Visigothic kings still dominated the peninsula, their courts plotting and praying, their bishops urging unity. The Byzantine presence was a reminder of old Rome, but only a faint one. Back in Constantinople, Justinian's reforms echoed louder than his conquests. The Corpus Juris Civilis, his great law code, outlasted every battle. Scholars in future centuries would study its clauses, weaving them into medieval law, Renaissance thought, and even modern justice. In a world of shifting borders, the written word endured. So too did Hagia Sophia, the great church. When sunlight streamed through its windows, worshippers felt as though heaven itself had opened above them. Candles glowed against marble, incense curled through domes. Choirs sang in harmonies that shook the soul. Centuries later, travelers would still gasp at its beauty. Justinian's empire might rise and falter, but Hagia Sophia stood as a promise of eternity. But if Constantinople reached for eternity, its people lived through fragility. The plague returned again and again, thinning families, emptying homes, silencing markets. Survivors spoke of neighbors buried in haste, of fields untended, of silence in streets once full of noise. Priests preached repentance, doctors searched in vain for cures, mothers held their children tightly. The empire did not collapse, but it lived with a shadow over its heart. Beyond its walls, new powers stirred. To the north, Slavs pressed into the Balkans, settling villages and carving out new homes. To the east, Persians clashed with Roman armies on old battlefields. To the west, Franks grew bolder, and in their new halls, new dynasties dreamed of crowns. The west, though fractured, was not lifeless. In Gaul, Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis, ruled from Paris and Metz. Their long hair was a symbol of power. To cut it was to strip them of kingship. Their courts were filled with nobles, warriors, and bishops. At feasts, songs praised their ancestors. At councils, scribes inked laws on parchment. They were rougher than Roman emperors, less polished, but their rule was real. The Franks were no longer just war bands, they were becoming a kingdom. In Spain, the Visigoths slowly drew closer to the faith of their people. Arian kings resisted, but Catholic bishops persisted. Councils met in Toledo, drafting laws, debating doctrine. Eventually, the rift would close, and Spain would be united under one faith. But in Justinian's day, that unity was still ahead. In Britain, beyond the reach of Rome or Byzantium, a different story unfolded. After Rome withdrew, waves of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes settled the land. Old towns decayed, but new kingdoms sprouted. Kent, Wessex, Mercia. Druids faded, priests preached, and stories of Arthur, whether myth or memory, spread by firelight. To travelers from Gaul, Britain seemed distant, broken, wild, but alive in its own way. Everywhere the memory of Rome lingered. Roads, though cracked, still stretched across landscapes. Aqueducts, though dry, still spanned valleys. Amphitheaters, though silent, still stood as reminders. People lived among ruins, their daily lives woven with relics of the past. Children played where senators once spoke, farmers plowed fields where legions once marched. And through it all, the church grew. Priests baptized children in stone fonts. Bishops argued theology with passion. Monks bent over manuscripts, copying letters stroke by stroke. They did not think of themselves as saviors of civilization, but they were. Without their patient work, so much would have been lost. The dream of restoration was never fully real. Justinian had stretched the empire's arms, but those arms grew weary. The lands he claimed often slipped away in time, yet his ambition left marks that outlasted his life. Laws, churches, legends, and the idea that Rome was never truly gone. For the people of the 6th century, it was an age of both wonder and worry. In Constantinople, golden domes shone. In Italy, armies clashed. In Gaul, kings feasted. In Britain, bards sang. The world was fragmented, but alive, and in that fragmentation, medieval Europe was quietly forming. The dream of Justinian's restoration faded with time, but its echoes lingered across centuries. His reign was remembered as a high tide, law renewed, churches raised, lands reclaimed. Yet after the tide came ebb. The empire endured, yes, but the world was moving on. In Italy, the wars left the land exhausted. Fields were scorched, villages abandoned, families scattered. Once fertile valleys lay fallow, and famine whispered through the hills. Byzantine governors ruled from Ravenna, but their grip was fragile. The Ostrogoths had fallen, but others would come. The Lombards, fierce and hungry for land. In the years after Justinian's death, they swept into Italy, carving out kingdoms of their own. The peninsula once more fractured. Rome itself reduced to a city under papal care, while emperors ruled from afar. For ordinary Italians, the cycle of power mattered less than the cycle of seasons. Whether Gothic, Byzantine, or Lombard, the ruler was distant. What mattered was whether the harvest grew, whether raids spared their village, whether the priest blessed their children. They lived among ruins, but they lived. In Africa, Byzantine officials kept Carthage alive, its harbors busy with ships, yet inland tribes pressed harder. Rebellions simmered, and soldiers marched endlessly to keep order. Africa remained part of the empire for more than a century, but it never again held the easy prosperity of Roman days. It was a frontier, both jewel and burden. Spain's Byzantine strip too proved fragile. For a few generations, imperial banners fluttered along its coasts, but Visigothic kings eventually pushed them back. The dream of restoring all Hispania faded, leaving the Visigoths to carry its fate. In time, their kingdom would fall to new powers from the south, but that was a story yet to come. Even as conquest waned, Constantinople itself remained a wonder. Travelers spoke of its walls, triple lines of stone and moat that no army could breach. They spoke of its markets where silk and spices were sold, of its churches glowing with gold, of its scholars debating theology with fire in their eyes. The city stood as a beacon of what Rome had been and what it still aspired to be. But beyond the empire's borders, new powers were growing. To the north, Slavic tribes spread across rivers and plains, their villages dotting the Balkans. To the west, Frankish kings consolidated, their dynasty stretching roots deeper with every generation. To the east, Persia clashed with Rome in endless rivalry, each seeking advantage, each wearing down the other. And on the horizon, unseen by most, a new faith was stirring in Arabia, one that would sweep across lands and alter history forever. But in the 6th century, that future was still hidden, waiting for its moment. For now, the Church was the true unifier of the West. Where emperors failed, bishops endured. Where armies faltered, monks persevered. The Pope in Rome, though not yet supreme, grew steadily more influential. Pilgrims came to Rome not for political power, but for holy relics, for blessings, for the aura of saints. Slowly, spiritual authority began to balance, sometimes even outweigh secular might. In monasteries, the quiet work of preservation continued. Picture a monk in a stone cell, hunched over parchment. His quill scratches lines of Latin, perhaps the words of Augustine, perhaps the poems of Virgil. He does not know that centuries later his careful strokes will be the reason those works survive. Outside, bells ring for prayer. Inside, history is saved one letter at a time. Legends grew in these years. Stories of saints who healed the sick, of hermits who faced demons, of kings who converted and brought whole peoples with them. These tales gave shape to identity, teaching children not only who they were, but who they might become. The empire was gone, but myths of holiness and heroism filled its space. And always, the ruins of Rome remained. Farmers plowed fields around broken aqueducts. Children played in amphitheaters where gladiators once fought. Pilgrims prayed in churches built inside old basilicas. The past was everywhere, a ghost that never left. Yet from those ghosts, a new world was being born. By the close of Justinian's reign, the Mediterranean world was changed. Rome's fall had shattered unity, but it had not ended civilization. Instead, it had reshaped it. The empire was smaller, the world harsher, but life endured, adapted, transformed, and prepared for the centuries to come. The people of the 6th century could not see the vast arc of history. They did not know that their age would be called medieval, that their struggles would be seen as the seedbed of nations. They only knew their daily lives, planting, praying, fearing, hoping. But through those lives, history moved forward. And so, the dream of restoration faded into the fabric of the Middle Ages. Justinian had reached far, but he could not turn back time. The Western Empire was gone, yet its echoes lived on, in laws, in faith, in ruins, in memory. The Middle Ages stretched ahead, a long road of darkness and light, struggle and triumph, sorrow and song. For listeners now, lying in the quiet of night, it is enough to know the story continued. The world after Rome did not end, it transformed. It seemed Rome had been reborn. In the reign of Justinian, the empire's armies had marched across the Mediterranean, reclaiming lost provinces that had once been the pride of Caesar and Augustus. North Africa wrested from the Vandals. Italy, retaken after centuries of barbarian rule. Even parts of Spain had briefly returned to imperial hands. In Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia rose like a crown of light, the largest and most magnificent church in Christendom. To stand beneath its dome was to feel the presence of heaven itself. To many Romans, it seemed that history had turned back, and that the old dream of empire had returned to life. But empires are not rebuilt by dreams alone. Behind the glory, Justinian had drained his treasury, stretched his armies thin, and left the countryside scarred by plague. The empire looked vast on a map, but its strength was fragile. And while the Mediterranean marveled at Rome's return, in the east an old enemy was waiting: Persia, proud, powerful, and patient. For centuries, Rome and Persia had circled each other like two lions, neither able to destroy the other, neither willing to step back. They had fought for Armenia, for Mesopotamia, for control of the great trade routes that linked east and west. They had signed treaties, exchanged prisoners, and even, at times, helped each other. But beneath the words and rituals, rivalry never died. And now, in the generation after Justinian's death, that rivalry would erupt into the most destructive war either empire had ever known. It would last decades, it would bleed both sides dry, and when it ended, the world would not be the same. To understand the war, we need to understand the stage. Rome and Persia were not simply neighbors, they were equals. Rome controlled the Mediterranean, the ancient Mare Nostrum. Persia ruled the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, the rich lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. Both had sophisticated armies, proud aristocracies, and ancient traditions and kingship. Their borders ran like scars across Armenia and the deserts of Syria. Fortresses dotted the frontier, Roman cities like Dara, Persian strongholds like Ctesiphon. The rivalry went back centuries. The Roman general Crassus, eager for glory, had led Roman legions into Parthia, meaning the Parthian Empire, which was named after a historical region located in northeastern Greater Iran in 53 BC, only to be crushed at the Battle of Karhai, east of the Euphrates River. His army slaughtered, his standards captured, his head sent to the Persian king as a trophy. Later, emperors like Trajan and Septimius Severus had marched deep into the east, conquering Mesopotamia for a time, but never holding it for long. When the Sassanid dynasty replaced the Parthians in the 3rd century, the rivalry only sharpened. The Persians were tougher, more centralized, and fiercely ambitious. They captured Roman emperors, sacked Roman cities, and threatened Syria and Anatolia. Rome struck back in turn, but neither side could ever land a killing blow. By Justinian's time, peace was bought with money. Rome paid subsidies to keep Persia quiet in the Caucasus, while both sides focused elsewhere. But peace would not outlive Justinian. When Justinian died in 565, the throne passed to his nephew Justin II. He inherited an empire that looked strong but was stretched thin. The treasury was weakened by wars in Italy and Africa. The countryside was scarred by plague. And in the east, Persia watched, waiting. Justin was proud. He wanted to prove himself worthy of his uncle's legacy. One of his first acts was to refuse the subsidies that Rome had been paying to Persia. To him, they were humiliating. To Persia, under the wise king Khosrau I, they were part of a carefully maintained balance. The refusal was an insult. Persian armies marched. They struck at Roman fortresses in Armenia and Syria. The war spread quickly, and Rome struggled to respond. Justin himself soon became part of the problem. Chroniclers describe his mind unraveling under the strain. He raved, screamed, and wept uncontrollably. He bit servants who came too close, barked like a dog, or sat frozen in silence. Constantinople whispered that the emperor was mad. Real power passed to his general Tiberius, but the damage was done. Rome was on the defensive again. When Justin II died in 578, Tiberius II became emperor in his own right. He was capable, generous, and more balanced than his predecessor. He used his personal fortune to aid the poor, distributed food to the hungry, and won admiration in Constantinople. But generosity could not erase the empire's problems. Wars burned on multiple fronts. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes were pouring southward, raiding deep into Roman lands. In the east, Persia pressed hard. Tiberius managed to hold the line, but he knew the task was greater than one man could carry. On his deathbed, he turned to his son-in-law, Maurice, and handed him the crown. Maurice would prove to be one of the most remarkable emperors of his age. Maurice took the throne in 582. Unlike Justin II, he was not impulsive. Unlike Tiberius, he was not merely a caretaker. Maurice was a soldier. Disciplined, pragmatic, and determined, he reorganized the army, cut unnecessary expenses, and imposed discipline on the frontier. His reign was hard but effective. In the Balkans, he fought campaigns against the Slavs and Avars, trying to hold the Danube frontier. In the east, he faced Persia, and here fortune suddenly gave him a chance. In Persia, King Hormizd IV faced rebellion. His generals turned against him, and he was overthrown. His son Khosrow II fled for his life. Desperate, Khosrow came to Maris. He begged for help. Maris saw the opportunity. Roman troops marched east, fought the usurpers, and restored Khosrow II to his throne. The alliance was sealed. In gratitude, Khosrow gave Rome territory in Armenia and signed a peace treaty. For the first time in living memory, the frontier was quiet. Maurice could turn his attention elsewhere. He reorganized the Balkans, sent settlers to strengthen the Danube frontier, and tried to restore order. But his strictness made him unpopular. He cut military pay. He refused to waste money on the circus game of Constantinople. He lived frugally, like a soldier in a tent. To the people he seemed cold. To the army he seemed stingy. In 602, resentment boiled over. The army mutinied. Maurice was overthrown. The new ruler was Phocas, a brutal centurion with no noble blood. Maurice and his sons were captured. Chroniclers say that Maurice was forced to watch as his children were executed, one by one, before being killed himself. Even in the brutal world of the Roman Empire, it was a shocking act. And in Persia, Khosrow II was furious. This was not just a murder, it was the death of a man who had saved his throne. To Khosrow, Phocas was a usurper, a criminal, and Persia would have its revenge. The murder of Maurice was the spark. For Persia it was more than politics, it was personal. Khosrow II owed his throne to Maurice, and now Maurice and his children lay butchered at the hands of a usurper. Khosrow saw himself not only as an avenger, but as the chosen instrument of justice. And so, Persia's armies marched. This was not a cautious raid, not a border war, not one of those endless little conflicts that had flared for centuries. This was a storm. Persian banners advanced into Roman Syria. City after city fell. Antioch, one of the greatest metropolises of the East, was captured in 611. The shock was immense. Antioch had been taken by Persians once before in late antiquity, but never held so easily, so completely. The city of golden streets and marble colonnades was reduced to another Persian garrison. 2 years later, in 613, Damascus was lost. Roman defenses collapsed. Panic spread through the provinces. And then in 614 came the unthinkable. Jerusalem fell. The holy city, sacred to Jews, Christians, and to the empire itself, had stood through centuries of war. Pilgrims came from across the world to walk its streets, to pray at the Holy Sepulchre, to gaze upon relics said to be touched by Christ himself. Now it was aflame. The Persians stormed the city after fierce fighting. Thousands of defenders and civilians were massacred. Churches were torn apart. Monasteries plundered. The Patriarch of Jerusalem was taken prisoner. But the wound that cut deepest was the loss of the true cross. This relic, believed to be the very cross upon which Christ had been crucified, was the most sacred treasure in Christendom. Processions had carried it through Constantinople in times of need. Soldiers had marched into battle with it before them. To the faithful, it was not just wood, it was the living proof of salvation. And now it was in Persian hands. Imagine the shock in Constantinople. The empire had lost Jerusalem, yes, but more than that, it seemed to have lost the favor of heaven itself. Chroniclers speak of people wailing in the streets, fasting, weeping, begging for God's mercy. To many it must have seemed as if the end of the world had come. If Jerusalem was a spiritual disaster, what followed was a practical one. In 618, the Persians conquered Egypt. The fertile valley of the Nile had fed Rome since the days of the Caesars. Its grain ships sailed north each year, bringing wheat to Constantinople, ensuring that the city's people, 500,000 strong, had bread. Without Egypt, famine loomed, and with Egypt fell the richest tax revenues of the empire. The financial lifeline of the state had been cut. Think of it, in less than a decade, Rome had lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. These were not distant provinces on the edges of the map. They were the very heart of the Eastern Empire, the lands of ancient pharaohs, the cities of Alexander, the holy city of Jerusalem itself, all now Persian. The empire of Justinian, the glittering rebirth, lay in ruins. In Constantinople, despair reigned. The new emperor, Heraclius, had taken the throne in 610, but what a throne it was! A gilded seat on a sinking ship. Heraclius was young, energetic, and brave, but he inherited a nightmare. The treasury was empty, the army demoralized. The people of Constantinople rioted over food shortages. At one point, Heraclius seriously considered abandoning the city. He thought of retreating to Carthage, the city of his birth, and making North Africa the new center of empire. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was desperation, but Heraclius stayed, and slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. He cut government expenses to the bone. He melted down church treasures, taking golden chalices and silver crosses to mint coins for soldiers' pay. He reorganized the army into themes, military districts where farmers became soldier settlers, tied to the defense of their own land, and most importantly, he began to cast the coming struggle not as a mere war, but as a holy cause. The Persians had stolen the cross. God's favor seemed to have deserted the Romans. But perhaps, Heraclius argued, this was a test. Perhaps the empire was being called not to despair but to rise. The empire would not go quietly. Between 618 and 622, Heraclius bided his time. The Persians controlled Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, but their armies were spread thin, garrisoning vast territories. Heraclius gathered what forces he could, trained them, and prepared for a counterstrike. The people of Constantinople must have lived those years like a long nightmare. Famine threatened. Persian armies were camped only days' march from Anatolia. Rumors whispered that Constantinople itself might be besieged. And yet, against all odds, Heraclius endured. Finally, in 622, he struck. In the spring of 622, after years of humiliation, Heraclius finally led his army east. Picture the scene, the emperor himself riding at the head of his soldiers, the banners of the empire snapping in the Anatolian wind, priests carrying icons and relics before the troops. The people had watched their empire crumble. Now they saw their emperor take the field as both general and holy warrior. Heraclius marched into Armenia, striking at Persian garrisons. The terrain was harsh. Jagged mountains, deep valleys, snow in winter and blazing sun in summer. But Heraclius knew how to fight in such conditions. His soldiers moved quickly, avoiding direct confrontation with larger Persian forces, ambushing supply trains, striking suddenly before disappearing into the hills. For the first time in years, the Romans were on the offensive. The Persian armies, spread thin across Syria and Egypt, struggled to respond. They had thought the empire broken. Now they faced an emperor who fought like a man with nothing left to lose. The campaign of 622 ended with Roman victories, and though limited, they were a spark of hope. Heraclius returned to Constantinople hailed as a savior, but he knew this was only the beginning. The war did not end in a single campaign. For the next 5 years, Heraclius waged a relentless war against Armenia and northern Mesopotamia. He struck deep into Persian territory, forcing Khosrow II to recall his armies from Syria. The fighting was brutal. Entire villages were burned. Soldiers endured freezing winters in the mountains and blistering summers on the plains. Battles raged around rivers and fortresses, with victories sometimes measured not in cities taken but in the survival of the army itself. But Heraclius had a strategy. He could not hope to match the Persians in sheer numbers. Instead, he waged war like a raider, choosing the time and place of battle, striking where Persians were weak. Slowly, year by year, he wore them down. Chroniclers describe how he inspired his men with fiery speeches, reminding them that they fought not just for land, but for the cross, for Christ, for the survival of their families. The war was framed as holy, and the soldiers believed it. Persia, once triumphant, was beginning to stumble. In 626, the war reached its most desperate moments. The Persians, allied with the nomadic Avars and Slavs, launched a bold plan. While Heraclius campaigned in the east, they would strike directly at the capital itself. A vast host gathered outside Constantinople. The Avars and Slavs attacked from the land side, while the Persians sent ships across the Bosphorus to join them. For the first time in centuries, the very heart of Rome was under siege. Inside the city, panic gripped the people. The emperor was far away. Supplies were limited. But Constantinople had one advantage no other city in the world possessed: the Theodosian walls. These colossal fortifications, triple layers of stone and towers, had stood since the 5th century. No army had ever breached them. Now they would be tested as never before. The defenders, soldiers, citizens, even monks, manned the walls day and night. Arrows, stones, and fire rained down on the attackers. Priests carried icons of the Virgin Mary through the streets, and people swore that she herself appeared upon the ramparts, protecting her city. The Persians tried to ferry troops across the water, but the Roman navy struck them down. The Avars launched massive siege towers, but the walls held firm. After weeks of fierce fighting, the allied host broke. The siege had failed. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had survived. It was a turning point. The empire had stared death in the face and endured. With his capital safe, Heraclius went on the attack. He gathered new allies, the Turkic Khazars of the steppe, and together they marched deep into Persian territory. Imagine it: Roman soldiers side by side with mounted steppe warriors, banners fluttering against the vast skies of Mesopotamia, advancing toward the very heart of Persia. The Persians, drained and divided, struggled to resist. Khosrow II had ruled with cruelty and arrogance. Now, as defeats mounted, his nobles began to whisper against him. In 627, the two great armies met near the ruins of Nineveh. The battlefield was bleak: rolling plains, winter fog, the ground hard with frost. Heraclius, despite illness and exhaustion, led his men personally. He knew this could be the battle that decided the fate of empires. The Persians struck first, confident in their numbers, but Heraclius had chosen his ground well. The fog concealed his maneuvers, and when the Persians advanced, the Romans counterattacked with precision. For hours the battle raged. Chroniclers describe Heraclius himself riding into combat, sword in hand, fighting like a common soldier. His courage steadied his men, and slowly the Persians broke. By day's end, the Persian army lay shattered. Roman soldiers trampled the standards of their enemy into the frozen earth. It was a victory as decisive as it was unexpected. The empire that had seemed doomed now stood triumphant. The news of Nineveh shook Persia to its core. Khosrow II, once the conqueror of Jerusalem and Egypt, was now seen as a failure. His nobles, weary of war and angered by his tyranny, turned against him. Within weeks he was overthrown and executed by his own son. The war was over. Rome and Persia, exhausted beyond measure, signed a peace. The Persians would withdraw from all conquered lands. The true cross would be returned. The Roman Empire, against all odds, had survived. The year was 630. After nearly 3 decades of disaster and struggle, Heraclius returned to Jerusalem. It was a moment crafted for history books and for sermons. The emperor himself, clad in simple robes, walked barefoot through the gates of the holy city. Before him was carried the true cross, the relic stolen by the Persians 16 years earlier. Crowds lined the streets. Monks and priests chanted hymns. The people wept openly as their emperor carried the cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For them this was not merely a victory, it was the vindication of faith itself. God had tested his empire and it had endured. Heraclius was hailed as a new Constantine, the equal of the first Christian emperor. Chroniclers compared him to King David of the Bible, the warrior king who defeated mighty enemies through faith and courage. And for a moment it seemed the Roman Empire was reborn again, just as in Justinian's day. But beneath the glittering ceremonies, the empire was hollowed. The wars had lasted nearly 30 years. Both empires, Rome and Persia, were exhausted beyond recognition. For Rome, the losses were staggering. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had been occupied for more than a decade. Their cities were scarred, their fields ruined, their populations displaced. The treasury was empty. Years of melting church plate and confiscating private wealth had barely kept the armies paid. The countryside of Anatolia had been stripped bare to feed troops on campaign. Farmers struggled to recover. For Persia, the situation was even worse. Their king was dead, executed by his own nobles. The nobility was fractured, with rival princes and generals seizing power. Their armies were broken, their fortresses abandoned, their confidence shattered. Rome had won, yes, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. A triumph so costly it nearly amounted to defeat. The two great lions of the ancient world had fought to exhaustion, and in the deserts of Arabia a new predator had been sharpening its claws. While Romans and Persians bled each other dry, something remarkable had taken root to the south. In the oases and caravan towns of Arabia, a prophet named Muhammad had begun to preach a new faith. When Heraclius marched barefoot into Jerusalem in 630, Muhammad was still alive, but within 2 years the prophet would die, leaving behind a united Arab community inspired by his message. For centuries the Arabs had been the overlooked neighbors of the great empires, useful as mercenaries, troublesome as raiders, but never a true threat. Now, driven by faith, discipline, and the hunger of a people long excluded from the wealth of empire, they exploded outward. In 633, Arab armies struck the Persians. Within a few years, Persia collapsed completely. The Sassanid dynasty, centuries old, was swept away. The empire of Khosrow II, once master of Jerusalem and Egypt, was gone forever. The Romans resisted longer, but they too were too weak to stop the tide. Syria and Palestine fell in the 630s. Egypt followed in 641. Heraclius, once hailed as the savior of the empire, lived long enough to see nearly all his victories undone. He died in 641, a broken man. The taste of triumph turned bitter. Looking back, historians see the War of Rome and Persia as the last act of an ancient play. For 700 years the two empires had fought, sometimes in shadow, sometimes in open battle. They had been the twin pillars of the old world, each defining itself against the other, and in the end they destroyed each other. Persia vanished. The proud Sassanid kings, heirs to Cyrus and Darius, were gone. Their empire dissolved into memory. Rome survived but transformed. The empire that once dreamed of uniting the Mediterranean was now a smaller, Greek-speaking state. Its heart was not Rome, nor even Jerusalem, but Constantinople. It would live on for centuries, but as something new, the Byzantine Empire. The old world of Caesars and Shahanshahs had ended. In its place, a new world had begun, a world of caliphs and sultans, a world where the Mediterranean was no longer the center of power, but just one part of a far larger stage. What can we learn from this war? First, that even the greatest empires are not invincible. Rome and Persia were the superpowers of their day, unmatched in wealth, armies, and prestige, yet they bled each other dry until neither could stand. Second, that history is not always a straight line. Justinian had dreamed of restoring Rome's glory, Heraclius had seemed to achieve it, and yet, within a single generation, much of that dream had crumbled. Victories can be fleeting, even when they feel eternal. And third, that history often turns not on the battles we expect, but on the ones that follow. Rome and Persia fought for Jerusalem, for Egypt, for the cross itself, but their true legacy was what came after, the rise of Islam, the reshaping of the ancient world into something new. When Justinian died in 565, the empire seemed reborn. When Heraclius carried the true cross back into Jerusalem in 630, it seemed reborn again. But between those two moments stretched a generation of fire and blood. Cities burned, armies clashed, emperors rose and fell. The rivalry of Rome and Persia, centuries old, reached its climax and ended with both empires broken. This was not just another war, it was the last Roman-Persian war, the final roar of two ancient lions before the desert winds carried in a new age. It was the war that broke two empires, and from its ruins, the world we know today began to take shape. Close your eyes and picture a road at dusk. It is straight, made of pale stones laid by careful hands long ago. Grass grows in the seams. The road once linked great cities, crossed mountains and rivers, and carried the weight of an empire. Now the air is still. A bird calls somewhere in a cypress. A cartwheel creaks in the distance, and then the sound fades. What remains is not the thunder of legions, not the bustle of merchants, but a long, soft silence. That silence is the feeling of the late 5th century. The Western Roman Empire has come to its end. A boy emperor has been led away, a general has declared himself king, and the purple robe that once meant dominion over the world has been packed into a chest and sent to Constantinople, far away across the sea. People do not all understand dates or titles, but they feel the change. The tax collector stops coming. The post rider does not arrive. The stones on the road sprout weeds. The great machine has slowed and then stilled. If we walk this road together, slowly and gently, we will see how the old world faded and a new one began to take shape. We will not rush. This is a story for sleep, a story to drift with, like a leaf on a calm river at evening. First, let us go to Ravenna, the marsh-ringed city where emperors once hid from danger. In a dim hall there, a child sits on a carved chair. His name is Romulus, called Augustulus, Little Augustus. His father, Orestes, is the true power, but even he cannot make the empire whole again. Far from the hall, the provinces have slipped away like islands after a flood. Spain answers to Visigothic kings, Gaul fractures under Burgundians and Franks. Africa belongs to Vandals who rule the waves with fast, hard-hitting ships. Britain, once bridged by Roman forts and roads, is already a place of memory. Its garrisons recalled and its people left to their own devices. Romulus is not cruel. He is simply small. Outside the city walls, men who call themselves federates sharpen blades and talk about land. They have fought for Rome for years, but their pay is uncertain, and they want fields in Italy for their children. Their commander is a tall man with sharp eyes named Odoacer. He asks for what his soldiers believe is owed. Orestes refuses. Swords are drawn. Orestes falls. The boy is spared, led away to a villa to live quietly. The men who carry the purple robe do not hail a new emperor in the west. They send the regalia east to the emperor in Constantinople, saying in effect that one emperor is enough for a world that has changed. What does the fall feel like for ordinary people? Not a single crash, not a day when the sky turns black, but a thinning. The baker still rises before dawn to heat the oven. The shepherd still counts his sheep, yet the safety net below them is gone. A bridge on the road to the next town collapses, and no imperial engineer comes to repair it. A village sends a message for help, and no garrison writes to answer. Bandits begin to test the edges of things, and farmers build low walls around their homes. Markets still open, but the traders come from closer by with fewer goods and more stories. Some places remain bright. In the city of Rome, the great basilicas rise where temples once stood. Pilgrims come to pray at tombs. The bishops keep records and offer judgment in disputes. They give alms in times of hunger. The old marble is not thrown away. It is taken from empty porticos and set into churches. A statue of an emperor loses its head. Its body becomes a saint above a doorway. Water still reaches fountains where aqueducts survive. Where they do not, the people draw from wells and carry the weight themselves, up steps and into courtyards where ivy climbs walls and cats watch from windowsills. To the west and south, the Vandals still hold North Africa. Their ships are quick as gulls, and for a time they rule the sea. Grain that once fed Italy now follows other paths, and prices rise in towns that cannot grow enough food for their own mouths. In Spain, the Visigoths rule from hilltop strongholds. Their kings keep Roman laws when those laws are useful and set them aside when they are not. Latin remains the language of decrees. Gothic remains the language of family and camp. In Gaul, a young king named Clovis listens more than he speaks, measuring which alliances will last longer than a winter. Italy itself passes from one pair of hands to another. Odoacer is careful at first. He keeps the Senate, bows to old forms, allows the church to do its work. He knows that his rule will be steadier if it rests on familiar tables and not just on the spears of his soldiers. In farmhouses and villas, life continues in rhythms set by seasons rather than emperors. Harvest, threshing, grape pressing, bread baking, weddings, births, and burials. A grandmother tells a child stories of the days when processions filled streets and officials rode past in bright chairs. The child cannot quite picture it, but he remembers the warmth of her hand and the way her voice falls at the end of a sentence like a bird to its nest. Beyond Italy, in the east, Constantinople shines. It is strong-walled and sea-wrapped, a city of domes and markets, of scholars and shipwrights. Here the empire still calls itself Roman. Its scribes copy laws, its generals drill troops, its harbor thrums with trade. The emperors there look west with a mixture of longing and caution. They remember Africa's grain and Italy's prestige. They also count their coins and weigh the danger. Persians on one frontier, steppe riders on another. The empire cannot be everywhere at once. Between the ruins and the palaces, in the quiet middle where most lives are lived, the monastery rises. A wooden bell rings at dawn. Men in plain robes file into a simple chapel. They chant psalms that echo off stone. Then they work, copying books in a room warmed by a small fire, scraping goatskins into parchment, drawing letters in careful ink. They plant gardens within low walls. They mend roofs. They tend the sick at the gate. When travelers come, dust-streaked and weary, the porter gives them water and places to rest. The monastery is not an army, not a senate, not a tax office. It is a steady place in a world that sways. Not all is gentle. In the borderlands, war flickers like brush fire. A chieftain dies, and rival cousins fight for his cloak. A Roman town refuses a new tax. A band of warriors arrives and takes what they want in kind. A priest tries to protect a flock and is struck down for his courage. Yet even here there is sometimes mercy. A warrior hears a hymn and remembers his mother's face. He lifts his hand from the blow. He lets the cow go and takes only the cart. He is not a statue with a perfect story. He is a man, and men are complicated even when history writes them as simple shapes. What of learning? It does not vanish, it moves. In the cities that remain strong, Ravenna, Arles, Rome, teachers still teach grammar and rhetoric. A boy memorizes Virgil by lamplight while his father counts jars of oil. In the countryside, the monastery school becomes a new lampstand. A patient monk sets a wax tablet before a child and guides small fingers through the alphabet. A is a house, he says. B is a gate. C is the curve of the moon. The child smiles. The letters are no longer spells of law and empire. They are tools for telling prayers and planting times and names. On feast days, the old Roman calendar has given way to the Christian year. Instead of games in amphitheaters, there are processions with candles. Instead of sacrifices at temples, there are masses where bread is broken and wine is blessed. A farmer who once thanked a household god at his doorway now scratches a cross on the lintel and whispers a prayer to the saints. The change is not always smooth. Some still leave little offerings at springs and groves when the priest is not looking. Old habits do not vanish. They sigh and settle into new seats. To feel the scale of change, let us walk a little farther, to a bridge over a slow river in Gaul. The bridge was built in the days of Augustus. It has stood through storms and floods, through wars, through the quiet passing of countless traders' footsteps. Now a stone has slipped, and one corner sags. The townspeople have spoken to their count, and the count has sent a letter, and the letter has gone nowhere. So, one morning, the miller and the potter and the shepherd and the priest walk to the bridge together with ropes and boards. They shore it up as best they can. It is not pretty, but it holds. The Roman way would have sent engineers with exact measurements and a plan. The new way sends neighbors with hands and hope. In Spain, a Visigothic king listens to a bishop in a hall that smells of smoke and wool. The bishop asks for protection for the poor during the winter scarcity. The king nods and issues a decree in Latin, the language of law, and then speaks to his household in his own tongue. Two worlds share a table. In the same land, a farmer hears the bandits have been hanged on the road and breathes easier. Another farmer hears that a levy of grain will be taken and tightens his belt. Power is close now, not far away in a distant marble city, and that closeness is both comfort and worry. In North Africa, the Vandals' confidence begins to fray. Their navy is proud, but the sea is not a wall, it is a door, and doors open both ways. Across the water in the east, plans are drawn on wax tablets. A general traces the coastline with his stylus and taps a harbor with the point. He talks about winds, about supply, about how to befriend the local towns once the ships arrive. He is thinking like a Roman of old, though he serves an emperor who now speaks Greek at court and signs decrees with a different flourish. Back in Italy, Odoacer rules with a certain plainness. He eats at simple tables, rides on muddy roads, listens more than he speaks. The Senate appreciates this. Many families keep their estates and their dignity. They write him letters that sound like the letters they once wrote to emperors. They address him with honorifics that feel comfortable on the tongue. In distant villas, an old mosaic floor grows new cracks, and grass pushes up in the atrium. A child finds a loose blue stone there and carries it in his fist all day, feeling its coolness and its weight. The stone is a piece of a picture he has never seen whole, and somewhere beyond all these scenes the seasons turn. Snow melts from a mountain shoulder, rivers swell and then subside, bees find blossoms in orchards and make honey in dark hives that smell of smoke. A widow sits by a window and mends a cloak with sturdy thread. She pauses, listens for hoofbeats, hears none and smiles. Her grandson sleeps with a wooden toy horse in his hands. She hopes the men who ride the real horses will pass her valley by this year. This, then, is the feeling at the edge of the old world, not the crash of a single day, but the long, low hush after a long, loud song. It is a time of endings and of first beginnings. The empire is gone from the west, but people still wake, work, love, and learn. New rulers are rougher and closer. Old stones are repurposed for new prayers. The map looks different to scholars, but to the child with the blue mosaic in his pocket, the map is the path to the stream, the wall that keeps the goats from the garden, the church door that sticks when it rains. If you stand again on that Roman road at dusk and look toward the horizon, you might see a dim glow far away, the glow of Constantinople, the city that still calls itself Rome. In time, emperors there will dream of reconquest. They will send fleets westward with bright-eyed generals at their helms. A great church with a floating dome will rise in their capital, and its windows will catch the morning light like a basket catching apples. But for now our road is quiet. The birds settle. The last cart for the day rattles into a yard and stops. Here we pause, not because the story has ended, but because night has come. In the morning we will walk on, to the halls where Franks make vows, to the scriptoriums where monks sharpen quills, to the harbors where sails are trimmed for journeys that will tie this broken world together again, thread by patient thread. When morning comes in our imagined 5th century world, dew lies in silver beads on barley stalks, and smoke lifts in slow ribbons from cottage hearths. Roosters call, a dog thumps its tail against a door. A farmer pulls on boots still damp from yesterday and steps into a lane that was once an imperial street. He does not speak of emperors, he speaks of weather. He watches the sky and guesses when to sow. His village lies where an old Roman villa once stood. The grand peristyle is gone, its columns broken and stacked to make a church wall. But the well still draws sweet water. The new church has a small apse and a squared tower where a bell hangs from an iron bracket. On Sundays they ring it, and the people gather. The priest's Latin is careful and learned. His homily is simple and kind. He blesses seeds in spring and candles in winter. And in times of fear he walks the boundary paths and prays for peace. In a house with shuttered windows near the church, a window keeps a small chest with letters tied in a faded ribbon. One letter describes a wedding under painted rafters. Another lists debts owed by tenants who are now only names. She does not expect answers to the letters she sends. Post riders no longer thunder into the courtyard and ask for fresh horses. Still she writes, and the very act of setting words on a page keeps the past from slipping entirely through her fingers. A boy she teaches can now make his letters and read the first lines of the Psalms. When he finishes, he bows, smiles shyly, and carries in wood for her stove. The world has narrowed, but it has not stopped. A peddler arrives with needles and bright thread and a handful of glass beads the color of rain. He says he has come from 3 valleys away. He says a new count judges fairly and punishes theft quickly. He says the market town weighs coins carefully now and that some coins are clipped thin at the edges. He sells the beads to a girl who pays him with a small sack of barley. He smiles, tucks the barley into his pack, and promises to come back in autumn. Far to the north, in a place of deep forests and cold rivers, men who will one day be called Franks meet in a hall blackened by smoke. They are tall, their hair plaited and tied. The greatest among them wears a cloak fastened with a brooch in the shape of a running animal. He is not yet the famous Clovis, but Clovis is coming, a young king with a sharp mind and a hunter's patience. His people have served Rome, fought Rome, and lived beside Rome, and now they will fill the space Rome has left. In years ahead he will stand in a river to be baptized, and the water will run cold past his knees, and a bishop will speak holy words, and a new thread will knot itself into the fabric of the West. In Italy, beyond our village, another figure strides onto the stage, Theodoric the Ostrogoth. He comes with banners and spears and promises order. He sits in Ravenna, where Romulus once sat and listens to the Senate with a courtesy that makes old men weep. He repairs roads and aqueducts, keeps grain moving, and pays soldiers on time. He wears a sword, but he also wears patience, for he knows that to rule a Roman land, one must respect Roman ways. When he dies, many will say, for a time under a Gothic king, Italy felt Roman again. Let us walk in imagination to Ravenna's churches to see what it meant to be Roman after Rome. Their ceilings sparkle with tiny glass cubes of blue and gold. Saints look down with calm eyes. Emperors in white robes stand in procession. Purple shoes bright beneath the hems. Jeweled book covers in their hands. Between them, a figure in a cloak with a metal brooch. Barbarian by birth, stands respectfully, as if to say, "We are new here, but we learn." Outside, water laps at the city's edge, and morning mist lies low over the marsh. Doors open and day begins. Meanwhile, in far Africa, the Vandals wake to a different sun. Their harbors are bright with sails, Their markets smell of olives and oranges and salt. They speak of Rome with a mix of pride and suspicion, like someone remembering an old employer who paid well and scolded often. Their kings worship in Arian churches and argue doctrine with Catholic bishops in town squares. From time to time, ships arrive from the east carrying men who study maps by lamplight and ask careful questions about wind and tide. The sea hears all plans without repeating them. The church, growing into a space left by emperors, is not only prayer and psalms. It is also lists and ledgers and letters. Bishops balance accounts and negotiate with warlords. Monasteries keep inventories of grain and oil and wine. A monastery without a cellarer is like a ship without a pilot, says an old rule. The cellarer's key hangs at his belt. He knows exactly how many loaves can be baked tomorrow and how much ale can be drawn without leaving the barrel too low for next week's feast. At the monastery gate, a woman arrives with a feverish child. The porter calls the infirmarian. He boils herbs, cools the boy's forehead with water, murmurs blessings. He does not work miracles. He offers attention and steady hands in a world that has become uncertain. The mother leaves with bread, and for a time she believes the world is gentle again. That belief itself is a kind of medicine. A strange thing happens in times like these. Stories grow thicker. When roads are unsafe and letters do not fly quickly from city to city, people weave their own threads. A soldier who has seen the sea speaks of waves as high as houses. A pilgrim swears he saw the bones of a giant. An old woman remembers a Roman governor whose ring shone like a little moon. Some stories are true, some are not. All of them help the nights feel shorter. If we linger in one town long enough, we will hear how law changes. Under Rome, a single law spoke to many peoples. Now, law sits on different chairs. A Goth is judged by Gothic law, a Roman by Roman law, a Burgundian by Burgundian law. A judge keeps more than one book on the table. He listens first, then asks, "Whose law shall I open?" For a while this patchwork holds. It is awkward, but it allows neighbors to live without feeling erased. Coins continue to pass from hand to hand, though more slowly than before. A new kingdom issues coins with a king's name, but the form is Roman, the bust in profile, the legend around the edge. Old habits of trust survive in metal. When coins are few, people pay in kind. Eggs, a hide, a basket of onions, a promise of a day's labor at harvest. A promise, written or spoken, is a kind of money too. In a town built on a hill, a scribe leans over a desk at dawn. He copies a letter from a bishop to a distant ruler. His ink freezes in winter and grows thin in summer. He warms his hands over a brazier and blows gently on each page. He writes the names of towns that have changed hands twice in a year. Still he writes them, because names matter. To name a place is to hold it for a moment against the blur of time. Not everything declines. Some crafts become finer in the quiet. Weavers no longer press to clothe armies by the thousands, experiments with new patterns. Smiths make clasps and buckles so intricate they look like lace made of bronze. A potter discovers a clay that fires to a soft red and becomes known for bowls that keep soup warm longer on cold nights. These are small victories, but small victories fill a life. When storms come, political storms, not those of rain and wind, the church bells ring for warnings as well as for prayer. Farmers drive goats into courtyards. The blacksmith bars his door and covers the forge. The priest brings the relics into the nave and lights extra candles. A line of men with spears crests the ridge and looks down on the town. If their leader thinks the town is poor, he passes by. If he thinks it rich, he comes down, takes bread and salt, demands wine, and leaves his wounded to be tended overnight. In the morning he ties a brooch to the priest's belt as payment and rides on. Sometimes after the men are gone, a town takes stock and discovers kindness it did not know it had. The baker gives away a week's loaves, the carpenter repairs a roof for nothing, the woman with the feverish child returns to the monastery with a jar of honey, though she has little to spare. In such gifts a new kind of strength grows, a strength not of walls but of hands joined together. At night, when shutters are closed and the hearths burn low, the old poems are told in lower voices. Someone sings of Aeneas and a burning city. Someone tells a tale learned from a soldier who once guarded a gate in faraway Africa. The stories are not textbooks. They are soft ropes thrown between the past and the present. Children fall asleep halfway through them, and the rope holds them anyway. As the years turn, words change. The Latin of the streets grows warmer at the edges, softer in the center. Future scholars will call these new sounds the beginnings of French, Spanish, Italian. But tonight, in these decades, just after Rome's fall, they are simply the way a grandmother speaks when she is tired, the way a boy calls to his brother across a stream. Farther east in Constantinople, a young emperor named Justinian will one day rise before dawn to pray and then to plan. He will speak of law, of restoring what can be restored, of building a church so beautiful that people will whisper when they stand beneath its dome. He will send men across water, Belisarius with his steady eyes, to North Africa and then to Italy. For a time, banners will fly that say empire again, but that is later. For now the East watches, measures, waits. Back in our village, a new generation is growing. They do not remember post riders or parades of governors in shining chairs. They remember the smell of wet wool and fresh bread, the feel of a wooden floor under bare feet, the sight of candles burning against winter afternoons. When they hear the word Rome, they think first of the bishop's chair, then of a far city where tombs are visited, then perhaps, faintly, of an idea of greatness like a story told by someone who smiles sadly as he tells it. A child finds the blue mosaic stone again on the windowsill and sets it in a line with 3 pebbles and a dried seed. He is making a pattern he cannot yet name. One evening, a stranger arrives leading a donkey with a wicker pannier. He asks for the priest, then for the headman, then for the old widow with the letters. He produces a folded sheet and a ring with a familiar crest. The sheet carries news. A cousin is alive in Arles. A shipment of salt will come in autumn. A dispute has been settled in the town's favor. The ring means the message is true. The widow weeps, then laughs. The stranger sleeps in the church porch and leaves at dawn with a heel of bread. That is what the aftermath of an empire is. Not only the falling of walls, but a slow building of paths between new houses. The big story, boy emperor, bold general, banners furled and folded, is real. So too is the small story. A child tracing letters on a wax tablet, a mason setting one brick on another, a bell ringing a little before sunrise because the man who rings it woke early and could not go back to sleep. If you listen now in the late hours, when even the dogs have stopped their restless turning, you can hear 2 voices speaking softly across the centuries. One is the old voice of Rome, patient and proud, still teaching how to lay roads straight, how to count years carefully, and how to keep records so promises do not blow away on the wind. The other is the fresh voice of the new kingdoms, eager and rough, singing of vows taken in a wooden hall, of loyalty to a living man rather than to a distant abstraction. Between these voices, a third voice has begun to hum, the voice of the church, not always wise, not always gentle, but steady, able to carry a tune for a very long time. It will teach people to read and to plant by saints' days, and to bury their dead under stone crosses and to wash wounds with boiled water. It will also make mistakes and take sides and sometimes forget the poor. But in this age, in this afterlight, it is a bridge, and bridges are precious when rivers run high. And so we leave the first part of this story with lamps lit in doorways, with monks bending over pages, with smiths polishing buckles that shine like captured stars. The road is still there under the grass. It will not vanish. It will wait for sandals and boots, for hooves and cartwheels, for messengers with seals and lovers with secrets. The empire is finished in the west, but life is not finished. It is only changing shape. Close your eyes and let that shape settle. Let the noise of the day move outward, like ripples beyond the reach of your boat. Tomorrow we will wake and walk again, toward Franks and Goths, toward queens who speak wisely and kings who listen, toward a far-off dome of a church that has not yet been built, and the soft thunder of new hoofbeats on old stones. For now, breathe and rest. The night is kind. The empire had ended in the West, but life did not. That is the great secret of history. Empires collapse, rulers die, banners are furled, yet ordinary days continue. Cows must still be milked, fires still lit, grain still threshed, children still cradled. The fall of Rome was a thunderclap, but after the thunder there was rain, and after the rain there was growth. In Gaul, the land once dotted with Roman villas and military camps, the world had shifted to new hands. The Franks were coming into their own. They were once seen as fierce outsiders, hired as soldiers, settled as federates on Roman soil, but now the federates were masters. The soil no longer belonged to Rome. It belonged to those who lived on it and could defend it. Among these new rulers rose Clovis, a young king with sharp eyes. He was no scholar, but he was quick to listen. He learned that power was not only won with swords, but also with oaths, alliances, and the quiet support of bishops. His men rode with spears and round shields painted with bold patterns. Yet their leader thought further than the next raid. He thought of kingdoms, of faith, and of legacy. The story is told that Clovis once prayed to the god of his wife, Clotilde, in the middle of a desperate battle. His old gods had failed him, and in his heart he asked the Christian God for help. Victory followed, and in time so did baptism. On that day, a bishop poured water over the king's head. The hall was filled with Frankish warriors, their faces stern, their eyes wary. Yet when their king bowed, many followed. The Franks were no longer simply a tribe of warriors. They had entered into the great story of Christendom, linking their future with the Church. This moment changed more than one kingdom. It signaled a shift across the West. The bishops, heirs of Rome's organization, now looked to Clovis as a partner. His rule gained legitimacy in their eyes, and through their support, his people gained a sense of permanence. What had been wild and uncertain now seemed anchored. Gaul, fractured after the Roman retreat, began to knit itself together again, not under the eagle of Rome, but under the lilies of the Franks. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Visigoths reigned. They had long lived alongside Romans, learning their ways, adopting their language of law and decree. Their kings sat on wooden thrones, not gilded ones, but they kept Roman consulars at their side. Latin was the tongue of scribes. Gothic remained the language of hearth and camp. This dual world was uneasy but enduring. Yet faith divided the land. The Visigoths were Arians, a branch of Christianity that denied the full divinity of Christ. The Catholic bishops and the Roman population that followed them resisted. Sermons turned sharp, letters to kings pleaded for unity. In market towns, people muttered against their rulers' fate. The seeds of conflict lay quietly in the soil, waiting for a season to sprout. But for now, Spain endured under Gothic rule, its cities smaller, its fields less crowded, yet still alive with trade and prayer. Across the Mediterranean, the Vandals held North Africa. Carthage, once Rome's great rival, was their capital now. Its harbors were busy with ships, its markets filled with olives, grain, and salted fish. The Vandals, too, were Arians, and Catholic priests sometimes found themselves exiled or silenced. Yet the city thrived for a time. The fountains still ran, the walls still stood, the harbor still welcomed sails from Sicily and beyond. The Vandals, fierce at sea, had once captured even Rome itself. Now they ruled the breadbasket of the empire. But across the water in Constantinople, eyes watched carefully. For the Eastern Empire, Africa was not forgotten. Plans formed in the minds of emperors and generals, plans to one day restore these lost lands to Roman order. For the ordinary farmer in Africa, Spain, or Gaul, such thoughts were distant. He rose at dawn, tended his goats, worried about the weather, and prayed for his children. The fall of emperors mattered less than the price of salt or the safety of the path to market. But even if distant, the tremors of power reached him eventually, in the tax he paid, in the language of the priest who blessed him, in the banner that flew over the nearest town. In Italy, the tremors were sharper. Odoacer, the man who had ended the boy emperor's reign, ruled carefully but without lasting strength. Into this stage marched Theodoric, leader of the Ostrogoths, tall, commanding, and raised for years as a hostage in Constantinople. Theodoric knew both the ways of his Gothic kin and the polish of Roman courts. He was a bridge between worlds. The struggle between Odoacer and Theodoric lasted years, with battles fought and truces broken. Finally, in Ravenna, at a banquet meant for peace, Theodoric killed his rival with his own hand. The kingdom was his, but unlike many conquerors, Theodoric built rather than destroyed. He respected the Senate, listened to Roman advisors, restored aqueducts, and repaired roads. He encouraged learning, welcomed artisans, and ensured food flowed into the cities. His Gothic warriors remained distinct from the Romans of Italy, but under his rule harmony existed. For a generation, Italy breathed more easily. In Ravenna, mosaics glittered in new churches. Christ shone as ruler of the cosmos, seated on thrones of blue and gold. Saints gazed with calm eyes from walls covered in glass and stone. Even Theodoric himself was shown, not as a barbarian king, but as a guardian of Roman tradition. Farmers sowed grain, children played in streets, merchants carried cloth and oil to market. For a time, Italy felt whole again. But peace is always temporary. When Theodoric died, his heirs could not hold the balance. Old rivalries returned. Italy once more became a prize fought over by others, a land rich with memories and marble, too tempting to leave untouched. While Italy rested uneasily under Gothic rule, the East continued to shine. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire. Its walls stretched tall and wide, layered in stone and brick, and its harbors curved like a protective arm into the sea. Merchants from distant lands crowded its markets. Spices from India, silk from China, furs from the north, and gold from Africa all met here, traded under the gaze of domes and towers. The people of Constantinople still called themselves Romans. They wrote in Greek more often than Latin, but in their hearts they were heirs of Augustus and Constantine. Their emperors wore crowns, their armies drilled on parade grounds, and their judges quoted old Roman law. In their courts, debates rang not only about taxes and trade, but about faith. For in these centuries, theology and empire were woven tightly together. It is in Constantinople that Justinian would rise. He would dream of restoring the empire to its former glory. And though his time belonged to the 6th century, already the foundations were being laid. Lawyers gathered old statutes into codices, organizing the wisdom of Roman law for future generations. Builders sketched plans for new churches. Generals drilled soldiers who would one day march west again, bearing banners of the double-headed eagle. But in the West, life took on a different rhythm. The old order of governors and legions was gone. In its place, bishops grew in stature. A bishop in a city like Arles or Toledo might be more powerful than a count. He spoke not only in churches but in town councils, judged disputes, and sometimes negotiated with kings. His words carried weight, for he stood as a symbol of permanence. Where rulers died in battle or were murdered in banquet halls, bishops often lived long, steady lives, shepherding their communities through storm after storm. The Pope in Rome gained more respect with each passing year. No emperor ruled in the West, yet the Pope's voice echoed through its lands. Pilgrims came to Rome not to speak to senators or generals, but to kneel at shrines of saints and seek the Pope's blessing. Letters passed between Rome and kings, and slowly the Pope became a figure no ruler could ignore. At the same time, monasteries grew. Small at first, they spread like seeds in fertile ground. Men and women withdrew from the chaos of cities and the bloodshed of kings, seeking lives of prayer and order. They rose at dawn to bells, prayed in cold chapels, worked fields, copied books, and sang psalms. Their lives were simple, but their influence stretched far. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving not only the scriptures but also the works of Roman poets, Greek philosophers, and Latin historians. The scratching of quills on parchment, hour after hour, preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. Imagine a quiet scriptorium. A monk bends over a desk, lit by a small oil lamp. His quill dips into ink, then scratches letters carefully across smooth parchment. Outside, wind rattles the shutters. A dog barks in the night, but inside the monk writes patiently. Virgil's Aeneid, Cicero's speeches, the Gospels. He writes not for himself, but for the generations yet to come. For villagers nearby, monasteries were more than houses of prayer. They were refuges. In famine, monks shared grain. In sickness, they offered herbs and care. In fear, they opened their gates. Slowly, the idea spread that the church was the one institution that never failed, never fled, never vanished. Kings could fall, borders could shift, but the church remained, offering stability. Meanwhile, Languages themselves were changing. The Latin once spoken in markets and courts was softening, bending, breaking into new forms. Farmers and traders no longer spoke in the crisp tones of Cicero. Their words slurred, their endings dropped, their sounds shifted. Over centuries, this spoken Latin would become French, Spanish, Italian, and others. Children in a Frankish village would no longer understand children in a Visigothic town, even though both were speaking what had once been the same tongue. Slowly, Europe's modern languages were born out of Rome's fading voice. Daily life in these centuries was slower, quieter, but not without struggle. Roads cracked and weeds pushed through. Where once a courier might gallop in a week from Gaul to Rome, now journeys took longer and fewer travelers dared them. Bridges crumbled and some towns dwindled to villages. Yet life endured. Farmers planted, shepherds led their flocks, potters shaped clay, and children learned from parents. Empires may vanish, but life goes on. At feasts in wooden halls, kings raised cups and singers told tales of ancestors. Around hearths, elders shared stories of Rome's grandeur, though each retelling grew hazier. Rome became not just history but legend, a golden age whose details faded into dreams. Once, they would say, roads stretched across the world. Once, fountains ran in every city. Once, soldiers in shining armor guarded the peace. Children listened wide-eyed, half believing, half dreaming. But new legends were being forged as well. Stories of Clovis, the baptized king of the Franks. Stories of Theodoric, who ruled Italians and Goths with justice. Stories of monks who tamed wilderness with prayer. These tales would echo for centuries, shaping the imagination of the Middle Ages. Still, danger never slept. Raiders prowled coasts, brigands stalked forests, wars flared at borders. Kingdoms rose and fell in the span of a single lifetime. For every harvest gathered, another was stolen by soldiers. For every church raised, another was burned. It was an age of both faith and fear, of endurance and uncertainty. And yet, in that uncertainty, a new Europe was forming. Its foundation was not marble palaces or imperial decrees, but villages, churches, and small communities bound by loyalty and faith. The fall of Rome had ended an age, but it had also cleared the ground for something different to grow. In the towns and countryside of former Roman lands, the rhythm of daily life was shifting. The wide, bustling cities of antiquity were quieter now, their stone forums often half empty, their amphitheaters crumbling. Yet markets still buzzed, though smaller, and farmers still brought goods to sell: grain, cheese, honey, wool. Children still laughed in narrow streets, chasing dogs or balancing on broken walls. The ruins of Rome were not just reminders of the past, they were playgrounds, workshops, and shelters for the present. In Gaul, now shaping itself into the Frankish kingdom, change was visible everywhere. Wooden halls rose where Roman villas had fallen. The old baths were silent, their tiles cracked, but churches rang bells that echoed across valleys. Monks walked in hooded habits, and bishops rode donkeys from village to village. The people no longer looked to Rome for order. They looked to their local lord or their priests. Clovis, king of the Franks, ruled not only with a sword, but with the symbol of the cross. His conversion gave his reign legitimacy in the eyes of the church, and that bond would last through the centuries. When he died, his sons divided his kingdom, squabbling and fighting, but the idea of a Frankish realm remained. Out of this seed, in time, would grow the kingdom of France. Meanwhile, in Hispania, the Visigoths faced their own struggles. Their kingdom stretched across plains and mountains, dotted with Roman towns like Toledo and Merida. Their kings wore crowns but also bore the burden of division. Arians on one side, Catholics on the other. Tension simmered. A ruler might try to bridge the gap, but suspicion lingered. In churches, sermons reminded people of the rift. In courts, whispers questioned loyalty. Yet life pressed on. Farmers sowed wheat, shepherds grazed flocks, potters shaped clay, and scribes inked decrees in Latin. The Vandals of North Africa enjoyed their moment of strength. Carthage, with its harbors and markets, was a jewel. Their fleets patrolled the Mediterranean. Their sails feared by traders and travelers alike. They raided Sicily, threatened Italy, and even carried away treasures from Rome. Yet their power was fragile. Unlike the Franks or Visigoths, the Vandals did not root themselves deeply in the land. Their kings leaned on the sea. Their people spread thin along coasts. Inland, Berber tribes watched, waiting. Far away, Constantinople waited too. In Italy, Theodoric's rule brought a rare stability. Ravenna shone with mosaics that glimmered like constellations. Aqueducts flowed again, and senators wore robes once more in ceremonies. For Romans who had lived through chaos, it felt as though the empire had returned, even if under Gothic hands. Yet everyone knew the balance was fragile. Theodoric was strong, but strength fades with death. Beyond these kingdoms, the countryside lived as it always had, close to the land. Picture a small village in Gaul. The houses are timber, their roofs thatched. Smoke curls from chimneys. Chickens scatter as a farmer drives his pigs to forage in the forest. Children carry water from a stream. An old woman sits by a doorway, spinning wool. Her words drift to her granddaughter. When I was young, my father saw soldiers marching with Roman standards. They kept the roads clear and brought news from far away. Now the roads are rough, and news is what travelers choose to tell. To the villagers, the empire is half memory, half legend. They live in a smaller world, yet within that smallness lies resilience. Families depend on each other, priests bless fields, and saints are invoked to guard against storms. Festivals mark the seasons. Life is hard, but it is steady. At the same time, new patterns of loyalty form. In Rome's days, allegiance was to the emperor. Distant but mighty. Now allegiance is local, to a lord who protects, to a bishop who guides, to a monastery that offers refuge. This shift will shape the whole medieval world. Kings may claim crowns, but daily life is ordered by the ties of lord and vassal, priest and parishioner. Meanwhile, across the sea, Constantinople grew ever more aware of its western cousins. From its high walls, emperors watched reports flow in. News of Gothic Italy, Vandal Africa, Frankish Gaul, Visigothic Spain. Each seemed both lost and reachable, distant and tempting. The dream of restoring Rome never fully died in the East. Generals whispered of campaigns. Courtiers urged patience. For now, Constantinople bided its time, but its eyes were fixed on the West. In monasteries, knowledge was being preserved quietly, without trumpets or fanfare. In one abbey, a young monk carefully copied the letters of a psalm. In another, an elder corrected a student's shaky script. The air smelled of ink and parchment, of candle smoke and woolen robes. Outside, fields of barley swayed, and bells marked the hours. These places became islands of order in seas of uncertainty. Travelers sought them for food and shelter, pilgrims for blessing and rulers for counsel. Slowly a new culture was emerging, neither Roman nor purely Gothic, but something in between. A Frankish lord might wear a Roman brooch. A Gothic king might issue laws in Latin. A Roman senator might send his son to serve a barbarian court. Cultures blended, languages shifted, faith deepened. From these mixtures, the medieval world was forming, brick by brick, prayer by prayer. The people of the 6th century did not know they were in the Middle Ages. They did not think of themselves as waiting for Renaissance or modernity. They simply lived, building homes, raising children, fearing raids, rejoicing at harvests. Yet, as they lived, they laid the foundations of centuries to come. The world after Rome was fragile, but it was not empty. In every corner of the old empire, people built lives from what remained. Roads cracked, but they were still walked. Statues toppled, but stones were reused to build churches. Latin faded, but new tongues grew in its place. Out of loss, something new was being born. In Gaul, the legacy of Clovis and his baptism lingered. Bishops praised him in sermons. Scribes recorded his deeds. His successors quarreled, but the idea of a Frankish kingdom tied to Christianity endured. Over time, it would become the backbone of medieval Europe, but in these early days it was still fragile. At feasts, warriors clashed cups and boasted of their fathers. At courts, bishops urged kings to protect the church. Every alliance was fragile, every promise a gamble, but the seed had been planted. In Spain, the Visigoths faced the challenge of faith. The rift between Arian rulers and Catholic subjects grew harder to ignore. Councils debated, priests argued, kings worried. A solution would come, but only in centuries ahead, for now the Visigothic kingdom was both strong and brittle, rich in culture yet divided at its core. Still, life in towns like Toledo and Cordoba carried on. Markets sold olives and wine, travelers crossed mountains, and bells rang from churches. Across the Mediterranean, the Vandals stood watch over their coasts. Carthage glittered with wealth, its harbors filled with ships, yet their kingdom was shallow-rooted. Berber tribes pressed from the deserts, Byzantines threatened from the seas. The Vandals had taken much, but they had not built deep. Their days of power, though bright, would prove short. In Italy, after Theodoric's death, the Gothic kingdom wavered. Senators whispered, bishops prayed, generals schemed. The balance Theodoric had held between Romans and Goths began to crack. Into the crack would step the armies of Constantinople, seeking to reclaim what had been lost. But for the moment, Italians lived in uneasy peace, watching the future with wary eyes. Meanwhile, in the countryside, life had its own rhythm. Picture a farm on the edge of Gaul. The house is timber, the floor of packed earth. A family rises before dawn. The father leads oxen to plow. The mother bakes bread on a clay hearth. Children carry water, chase geese, gather wood. Their lives are tied to the land, to the harvest, to the seasons. Stories of emperors and kings may reach their ears, but their hearts are occupied with simpler matters. Whether the wheat will grow, whether the winter will be kind, whether their children will live to marry. In towns, artisans carried on crafts handed down for centuries. A blacksmith hammered iron into plowshares, horseshoes or swords. A weaver stretched wool across a loom, her shuttle tapping like a heartbeat. A potter spun clay into jars for oil and grain. The empire had ended, but work did not. The skills of Rome lived on in hands and tools, in crafts and trades, in the quiet persistence of ordinary people. The church, even more central, gave structure to this world. Priests baptized children, married couples buried the dead. Bishops judged disputes when kings were far away. Monks prayed and copied, their days marked by bells. The rhythm of prayer became the rhythm of life, binding people to something larger than themselves. In the silence of chapels, under the glow of candles, faith offered meaning. Legends of Rome lingered, but new legends were forming. Tales of saints filled the void once held by emperors. Children heard stories of martyrs who braved lions, of monks who faced demons, of bishops who confronted kings. These tales shaped imagination, turning the Middle Ages into an age of faith as much as an age of swords. Yet even faith could not banish fear. The world was dangerous. A family might pray for safe harvest, yet a raid could strip their barns. A town might ring church bells, yet plague could still sweep through its streets. Life was fragile, precious, uncertain. Perhaps that is why people clung to prayer so fiercely, because it gave them hope in a world they could not control. Meanwhile, the East prepared. Constantinople did not forget the West. It dreamed of reconquest. Its emperors studied maps. Its generals sharpened plans. One day they would march again, bearing banners of the empire. One day the eagle would return. But that is another chapter still to come. For now the fractured West drifted forward, piece by piece. Villages grew around churches. Towns shrank but endured. Kingdoms squabbled, but roots deepened. The Middle Ages had begun, not with sudden brilliance, but with slow persistence. Imagine walking along an old Roman road in the 6th century. Grass pushes through cracks, but the stones are still there. Along the road a traveler walks, cloak wrapped tight, staff in hand. He passes fields, forests, villages. He hears bells in the distance, the bark of dogs, the voices of farmers. Once this road carried legions. Now it carries pilgrims, merchants, wandering monks. Rome is gone, but life goes on. So the West after Rome was not empty, nor was it peaceful. It was a landscape of kings and bishops, of farms and monasteries, of raids and prayers. The empire had fallen, but in its ruins, new worlds were forming. The Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy. Each carried pieces of Rome, each reshaped them in their own way. And while they ruled, the ordinary people endured. They tilled, prayed, sang, wept, and hoped. They built the quiet foundations on which all of medieval Europe would stand. The thunder of Rome had faded, but the rain had fallen, and in the soil, new seeds had begun to grow.